I survived a night in a ghost town haunted by a monstrous dogman. Before we begin the story, let's meet the person who lived through this terrifying experience. Marcus, 28 years old, from Detroit, Michigan, shared this story that will change the way you see the night. Welcome to the Mr. Nightmare Scares You channel. If this is your first time here, prepare yourself for true horror, and if you're already a loyal subscriber, it's great to have you back for another dive into the darkness. Here is the first major part of our roadmap, divided into exactly 5 chapters focused on. Look, I don't expect you to believe me right away. If someone had told me this a year ago, I probably would have laughed and said they'd been watching too many Hollywood movies. But what I saw that cold autumn night completely changed my life. It changed how I look at the shadows in the forest and why I never leave the house after sunset anymore. I need to get this out, man. It's like a giant weight on my chest that's been suffocating me for months, and telling you this is my only chance to try and get a normal night's sleep again. It all started because of a damn curiosity and that idiotic habit our generation has of thinking danger is just a backdrop to get views on the internet. I'm an urban photographer, one of those guys who likes to explore abandoned places, villages that time forgot, and old factories. The isolation of those places gave me a unique adrenaline rush. But that particular town in northern Michigan had something very wrong with it. It was freezing cold, around 30 degrees Celsius, and the wind cut through my skin like a razor blade. I was driving my old pickup truck down a back road, surrounded by trees so tall and dense they seemed to swallow the little light that remained of the twilight. The car radio started crackling out of nowhere, an irritating static that seemed to fill the space before disappearing completely, leaving me in absolute and unsettling silence. It was then that I spotted the old wooden sign, almost falling down, indicating the entrance to Ashwood. It was a ghost town that had been evacuated in the 1970s because of water contamination, or at least that was the official story the government spread to hide the true horror that inhabited those lands. I stopped the car at the entrance to the village and pulled the handbrake. The silence outside wasn't an ordinary silence, the kind that brings you peace. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath, afraid of something terrible that was about to happen. I turned off the engine and stood there for a few seconds, just watching the silhouettes of the rotting wooden houses rising in the growing darkness. I was alone, miles away from any sign of civilization or medical help. My phone didn't have a single signal. I should have turned around right there. My instinct was screaming at me to start the engine and floor it until I disappeared off that cursed road. But pride got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight, my professional camera, and opened the car door, stepping on the dry leaves that crunched under my heavy boots. The air I breathed was thick with dense white clouds, due to the intense cold of that autumn night. The fog began to rise from the forest floor, creeping between the abandoned structures of Ashwood like the tentacles of an invisible monster. I walked about 200 feet toward what seemed to be the main street of the ghost town. The broken windows of the houses looked like black eyes staring intently at me through the darkness. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps and my accelerated breathing, which was already beginning to show signs of the fear settling in my chest. I was pointing my flashlight in all directions, trying to capture some sinister images for my photography portfolio. That's when I passed near an old abandoned church, its wooden cross lying on the ground, rotting in the damp soil. A strong smell suddenly hit me. It wasn't the smell of wet vegetation or old wood. It was a rotten, pungent odor, reminiscent of decomposing flesh mixed with the smell of a wet, dirty animal. The stench was so intense it made me nauseous instantly, and I had to cover my nose with the collar of my heavy coat to avoid vomiting. I stopped walking immediately. It was at that exact moment that I heard a strange noise coming from the bushes surrounding the side of the abandoned church. It wasn't the sound of a squirrel or a deer running. It was the sound of something very heavy moving bizarrely through the dense vegetation. Heavy footsteps that made the ground vibrate subtly beneath my feet. I directed the beam of my flashlight toward the noise, my hands trembling so much that the light danced frantically across the old wooden walls. At first I saw nothing but dry branches and distorted shadows, but then about 50 feet from where I was standing, the light from my flashlight reflected off something that made my blood instantly freeze in my veins. 2 bright yellowish points stared back at me from the darkness. They were gigantic eyes, gleaming with an aggressive tapestry-like reflection, situated at a height no normal creature in that region should have. Those eyes were positioned at least 7 feet from the ground, and the malevolence contained in that gaze completely paralyzed me, preventing my muscles from responding to my escape commands. The fear I felt at that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was a primal dread, the kind of terror that alerts your brain that you've gone from being at the top of the food chain to being helpless prey in the middle of nowhere. Those bright yellow eyes remained fixed on me without blinking once. I tried to keep the flashlight focused on the silhouette, and what began to take shape before me defied all logic and modern science. Among the trees of that dark forest, I began to distinguish the outline of a massive body, covered in dark, almost black fur that seemed to absorb the little light that remained in the environment. The creature's chest was absurdly wide, with long arms ending in bulky hands with dark, sharp claws that lightly scratched the trunk of a nearby tree. But what horrified me most was the shape of its head. It wasn't the head of a bear, and certainly not the head of a man. It was the head of a wild canid, a wolf or a gigantic hunting dog, with an elongated snout and pointed ears that moved attentively, capturing every sound of my desperate breathing. The creature let out a low sound, a deep guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within its muscular chest. The sound was so deep that I not only heard it, I felt the vibration in my own sternum, making my teeth chatter with pure terror. At that moment, I realized I was facing the legendary Dogman of Michigan, the monstrous creature that natives and locals spoke of in whispers around campfires, but which everyone treated as just an urban myth to scare tourists. It wasn't a myth. It was there, alive, breathing the same cold air as me, and staring at me as if deciding the best way to tear me apart. My legs finally seemed to awaken from their trance of terror, and I began to take slow steps backward, without diverting the flashlight from that monster for even a second, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger a devastating attack from that beast. Every inch I retreated felt like an eternity. The creature sensed my retreat and did something that made me let out a muffled groan of pure despair. It took a step forward, partially emerging from the protection of the dense bushes and revealing even more of its grotesque anatomy. The monster moved on its hind legs like a human, but its legs had the anatomy of a canine, with inverted joints that gave it an arched, yet extremely agile and powerful posture. It was easily over 7 feet tall, and had musculature that seemed to tear through its thick, dark-furred skin. When the light from my flashlight hit its face directly, I could see its teeth. The monster slightly opened its mouth, revealing rows of long, sharp, white teeth, salivating profusely in anticipation of the hunt. Saliva dripped from its canines and fell onto the frozen ground, creating an image that seemed straight out of my worst childhood nightmares. His gaze wasn't that of an irrational animal attacking out of hunger or territorial defense. It was an intelligent, sadistic gaze, the gaze of a being who took pleasure in seeing the despair and terror etched on my face. I could hear the sound of his claws scraping against the stones on the ground as he positioned himself to advance. The strong wind blew again, making the doors of the abandoned houses bang loudly around the ghost town square, further intensifying the horror movie atmosphere I was experiencing firsthand. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out, a way to survive that cursed night. The pickup truck was about 150 feet behind me, but I knew that if I turned my back to run, that beast would catch me in seconds. The dogman was a perfect killing machine, molded for hunting in those dark forests, and I was just a defenseless intruder in his domain of blood and total isolation. The tension in the atmosphere was so palpable that the air felt too heavy to breathe. I kept backing away step by step, trying not to stumble on the stones and branches that covered the ground of Ashwood's abandoned street. The monster raised its head toward the dark sky and let out a sound I will never forget for the rest of my days. It wasn't an ordinary wolf howl. It was a hybrid sound, a terrifying mixture of a human scream of agony with the savage howl of a hungry predator. The sound echoed throughout the ghost town, hitting the walls of the wooden houses and returning as a deafening echo that made my heart skip a beat. As soon as the echo of the scream ceased, the dogman lowered its body, supporting its front paws on the ground for a brief moment before lunging forward with unbelievable speed. It was running toward me. Terror gripped my entire being, and my survival instinct took complete control of my body. I turned my back and started running like I'd never run before in my life. I forgot the camera. I forgot my pride. I forgot everything. Focused only on reaching the safety of my old pickup truck parked at the entrance to town. I could hear the sound of its heavy footsteps right behind me, breaking branches and crushing everything in its path with devastating brute force. The distance between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. I ran desperately through the darkness, pointing my flashlight ahead to avoid hitting any walls or trees. The freezing cold burned my lungs with every breath I took, and my legs were already burning from the extreme effort. I could hear the monster's heavy, panting breath rapidly approaching my back, and the rotten smell of decaying flesh returned to fill the air around me, indicating that the monstrous creature was only a few feet away from reaching me and tearing my flesh without any mercy. I could feel the heat of that monster's breath on my back, a hot breath that contrasted violently with the 30 degrees of that freezing night. My heavy boots pounded against the dirt and gravel ground, and panic gave me a strength I didn't even know I had. The pickup truck was right there, about 50 feet away, but it felt like space was distorting and the distance only increased. I knew deep down that if I tried to open the car door, search for the keys in my coat pocket, and climb into the seat, that beast would get me before I even put the key in the ignition. It was too fast, a machine of muscles and dark hair that crossed the ground like lightning. In a pure survival reflex, I abruptly changed course to the left, throwing my body toward the porch of a 2-story wooden house that seemed slightly sturdier than the others. I climbed the 3 old wooden steps at once, hearing the planks groan terrifyingly under my weight. I threw myself against the front door of the abandoned residence. To my desperate relief, the old lock snapped shut with a dry crack, and I tumbled into the house in near total darkness. I turned immediately, slamming the solid wood door shut and pushing aside a heavy oak chest of drawers that stood right in the doorway to barricade myself. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I leaned against the chest of drawers, my heart pounding so hard in my ribs it felt like it would tear my chest apart. On the other side of the door, the sound of heavy footsteps ceased for a moment. Everything was silent again, a deathly silence that hurt my ears. I held my breath, trying not to make the slightest sound, praying to any divine force that the monstrous creature would think I had continued running towards the dense forest surrounding the ghost town of Ashwood. A few seconds passed that felt like hours. The air inside that abandoned house smelled of mold, dust accumulated over decades, and dead rats. I didn't dare turn the flashlight on again. The little light I had came from the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden boards, sealing the broken windows. I was trapped. I looked around and realized I was in what used to be the living room of a family that had probably fled that place in a hurry. There were old torn newspapers on the floor, a faded armchair with its springs sticking out, and a trail of destruction left by time. Suddenly a scratching sound began to echo from outside the door. It was claws, long dark claws scratching the thick wood of the entrance from top to bottom, slowly, as if the monster were testing the strength of my barrier or playing with my psychology. The sound was torturous. Scratch, scratch, go scratch. I covered my mouth with both hands to stifle a sob of terror. The creature knew I was in there. It had my scent. It had heard the sound of the door breaking. The dogman was simply savoring the moment, like a cat playing with a cornered mouse before making its final pounce. The low, guttural growl resumed outside, making the wooden structure of the house vibrate subtly. "Go away, please. Go away," I thought, a desperate mantra in my mind, feeling cold tears of pure terror begin to stream down my cheeks. I was completely isolated. No cell phone signal, miles away from Detroit. In a ghost town no one dared visit, facing a predator that science insisted didn't exist. I was completely on my own. Realizing the front door wouldn't hold much longer if that beast decided to use its brute force, I began to back away from the entrance, walking backward and feeling my way along the walls covered in torn, damp wallpaper. Each step was a risk. The wooden floor creaked with every movement, and each crack sounded like a shotgun blast in that sepulchral silence. I entered a narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. The temperature seemed to have dropped even further inside, and I could see the vapor of my breath even in the dim light. The hallway led to a destroyed kitchen, with overturned cabinets and broken dishes scattered across the floor, and a staircase leading to the second floor. I was torn. If I went upstairs, I would be trapping myself even more, with no escape route if he got in. If I stayed in the kitchen, I might find a back door, but the dense forests of Michigan would be right outside, and the dogman was the master of that dark woods. As I struggled to decide, a violent crash echoed from the front of the house. The oak chest of drawers shifted a few inches forward. The monster had rammed its heavy body against the door. The sound of the wood creaking and cracking made me jump back. I couldn't think anymore. I ran towards the wooden stairs, trying to climb as quickly and quietly as possible, bracing my hands on the upper steps to distribute my weight and prevent them from creaking too much. I climbed the 10 steps and reached a small landing on the second floor, which gave access to 3 small, dark rooms. I chose the back room, the one furthest from the stairs, hoping that the wooden labyrinth of that old house would at least buy me a few minutes of my life. I entered the room and slowly closed the door, leaving only a tiny crack so I could watch the upstairs hallway. The room contained only an old single bed without a mattress and a window locked with thick boards nailed to the outside. I was trapped inside a wooden matchbox. Downstairs, I heard the final sound of destruction. The front door gave way completely with a deafening crack of splintering wood. The dresser was dragged across the floor with terrifying ease, making a shrill noise that sent shivers down my spine. And then silence reigned again, but now the monster was inside the house. I could hear the sound of its claws snapping against the wooden floor of the downstairs hallway. Click, click, click. He walked slowly, without any hurry. The putrid smell of decaying flesh and wild animal rose through the stairwell, quickly infesting the second floor. It was such a dense odor that it seemed to fill the room where I was, making the air suffocating. The dogman began sniffing loudly. The sound of air being forcefully drawn in by his elongated snout echoed off the empty walls. He was hunting me by scent. I heard the monster enter the kitchen, knocking down what remained of the cupboards with a casual swipe of his sharp claws. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted me to completely panic. He wanted me to run out of my hiding place so that the chase would be more fun for him. The intelligence of that creature was the most terrifying part of this whole situation. It wasn't a wolf acting on instinct from hunger. It was something cruel that understood the concept of fear and fed on the human desperation of its prey. I stood paralyzed behind the bedroom door, peering through the narrow crack, eyes wide and body tense like a spring about to snap shut. The heavy footsteps and the clicking of claws began to approach the base of the stairs. Each step he climbed made the entire structure of the old house groan and creak under the massive weight of the creature, over 7 feet tall. I could hear his heavy breathing, a noisy, asthmatic sound that filled the second-floor hallway as he ascended the last steps. His silhouette finally appeared at the top of the stairs, bathed in the faint moonlight streaming through the hallway window. Seeing that monster up close again, even if only its silhouette, almost made my heart stop. His back was slightly arched, covered in that thick black fur, and his long arms ended in claws that almost touched the wooden floor. His pointed ears were erect, picking up every tiny sound of the night. Dogman stopped in the middle of the second-floor hallway, just 20 feet from where I was hiding. He turned his gigantic canine head slowly to the left, looking at the first empty room. Then he turned to the right, facing the second room. He let out a low growl, a vibration that made the broken glass of the hallway window tremble. He began to walk toward my room, step by step, dragging one of his sharp claws along the plaster wall of the hallway, leaving a deep groove and a shrill sound that seemed to tear at my own sanity. I knew that if he opened that door, it would be my ultimate end. I needed to do something, anything, or that autumn night in Ashwood would be the last thing I saw in my life. The deep groove that creature's claw left in the plaster wall made a sharp, almost metallic sound that seemed to pierce my eardrums. Screech! The sound stopped right in front of the door to the room where I was trapped. I could see its massive shadow completely blocking the sliver of light coming from the hallway. The silhouette of its elongated snout was projected against the weathered wood of the door. The monster pressed its snout against the crack and gasped for air. The sound of its breath inhaling my fear was audible and terrifying. I was less than 2 feet away from that mouth full of sharp teeth, separated only by a sheet of old, rotten pine wood. The stench of decaying flesh seeped in through the cracks, flooding my nostrils so forcefully that my eyes began to water. I clenched my teeth so hard that I felt my jaw snap, fighting the automatic reflex to cough or gag at the unbearable odor. The monster gave a light headbutt to the door, testing its resistance, causing the wood to vibrate against my chest. I didn't move. I looked like an ice statue, praying that he would think the strong, musty smell in the room was masking my presence, or that I had jumped out the back window. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, the creature stood completely still. All that could be heard was the howling wind outside, shaking the trees of that dense Michigan forest. The dogman took a step back, and the click of his claws on the ground indicated that he was slowly moving away toward the main hallway. I exhaled slowly, feeling a momentary relief, but one that would be short-lived. Relief turned to utter terror when I realized the monster's silence didn't mean it had given up the hunt. It had changed its strategy. I heard a violent noise coming from outside the house, the sound of heavy claws climbing and scratching the exterior wooden wall with terrifying ease. The creature was scaling the facade of the residence. I immediately looked at the bedroom window. As I said, it was locked with thick boards nailed from the outside, but the inner glass was still there, dirty and cracked. The sound of the climbing claws grew louder, approaching the height of the second floor. Suddenly, the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the boards was blocked. 2 gigantic yellow eyes emerged from the gap between the window panes, staring directly at me from the depths of the room's darkness. The monster saw me. It let out a sharp, violent growl, and with a single blow of its front paw it shattered the wooden boards and the window glass in one fell swoop. Pieces of glass flew across the room like projectiles, and I threw my arms in front of my face to protect myself from the shards that cut the sleeve of my heavy coat. The 30-degree cold of the night entered the room with full force, bringing with it the strong wind and the massive body of the dogman, which began to force its way in through the locked window. The entire wall structure began to crumble under the immense force of that beast, with nails flying out and supporting beams cracking from the impact. Without a second thought, I pushed open the bedroom door and threw myself back into the dark second-floor hallway, just as the window wall collapsed into the room with a deafening crash. I could hear the monster growling in frustration as it realized I had escaped its initial attack. I ran towards the stairs, but my boots slipped on a loose piece of plaster, and I tumbled down the first 4 steps, hitting my back and shoulder hard against the hard wood. The pain was sharp, a violent stab that almost knocked me unconscious, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins was so brutal that I jumped up, ignoring the physical pain. I looked up and saw the dogman emerging from the room and positioning itself at the top of the stairs. It was on 2 legs, its head almost touching the hallway ceiling, looking even larger and more menacing in the direct moonlight that now streamed through the shattered window. He opened his mouth, salivating profusely, and let out that terrifying hybrid howl that seemed to mix the agony of a man with the fury of a wild wolf. I ran down the remaining steps, practically throwing myself to the first floor. I needed to get out of that house immediately. The destroyed kitchen was to my right, and I spotted a small wooden door that probably led to the backyard. I ran to it, gripping the rusty doorknob with all the strength I had left in my trembling hands. The doorknob was stuck. I twisted it forcefully, strained with my shoulder, but the dampness and time had sealed that door almost permanently. Back there, I heard the heavy impact of the dogman leaping from the top of the stairs straight onto the living room floor. The impact made the wooden floor tremble so much that several old dishes remaining in the kitchen cabinets fell and shattered on the floor. Desperate, I grabbed an old wooden chair that was lying near the table and slammed it with all my might against the central panel of the back door. The rotten wood gave way, creating a hole wide enough for me to squeeze through. I threw my body sideways through the torn opening, feeling the splinters of wood scratch my clothes and skin, and fell face first into the tall, frozen grass of the backyard. The cold night air hit my face, bringing me back to the reality of the nightmare. I was in the backyard, surrounded by a fallen barbed wire fence and the impenetrable darkness of the Michigan forests. I looked back in time to see the dogman's monstrous head pierce through the hole I'd made in the door, its sharp teeth gleaming and its yellow eyes focused on my silhouette lying on the grass. I staggered to my feet, my whole body protesting the effort, and began running toward the side of the house, trying to circle around to reach the main road where my old pickup truck was parked. The distance to the front of the house seemed like an eternity. The tall grass was damp and slippery from the thin ice that was beginning to form on the surface due to the 30-degree temperature. I could hear the monster tearing down the rest of the back door to get out of the house and begin the chase across the open field. The sound of its heavy paws pounding the wet earth right behind me was the sound of my own death approaching. I rounded the corner of the house and spotted the Ashwood dirt road. My black pickup truck was there, about 100 feet away, parked under the pale moonlight. It was my only salvation, my only chance to get out of that ghost town, haunted by that damned creature alive. I shoved my hand into my coat pocket as I ran, desperately groping until my fingers finally found the cold metal of the keychain. I pulled the keys out, but with the trembling of my hands and the panic clouding my vision, the keychain slipped and fell into the dry leaves on the road. I stopped immediately, turning and dropping to my knees to search for the keys in the darkness, while I heard the triumphant growl of the dogman, who was already emerging from the side of the abandoned house, ready for the final attack. The panic that gripped me when I saw those keys vanish amidst the dry leaves was indescribable. My hands scratched at the cold earth, the dry branches and the dead leaves in blind despair. I could hear the sound of Dogman's heavy footsteps changing rhythm. He wasn't walking anymore. He had started running toward me, using all 4 paws to gain devastating speed. The ground trembled subtly beneath my knees. "I found it, please, I found it," I screamed internally as my fingers finally closed around the metal of the keychain. I pulled the keys up, just as a gigantic shadow fell over me, completely blocking the moonlight. The putrid smell of decaying flesh was so dense, it felt like a physical barrier in the air. I threw myself to the side on the dirt floor, just as a massive paw, equipped with dark 4-inch long claws, struck the exact spot where I had been a millisecond before. The impact of the kick tore a deep furrow in the frozen earth and scattered dry leaves everywhere. I rolled across the ground, feeling the stones cut my face, but I held onto the keys clutched between my fingers as if my life depended on it, and it truly did. I staggered to my feet, the pickup truck only 20 feet away. I ran the last few feet, separating me from the old pickup truck as if my body were on fire. I threw myself against the driver's side door, shoved the key into the lock with a trembling hand that scratched the car's paint, and turned the latch. The door opened with a heavy creak. I threw myself into the torn leather seat and slammed the door shut with all my might, locking the internal pin immediately. Before I could even breathe, a brutal impact shook the entire pickup truck. The dogman had thrown itself against the side of the vehicle. The creature's massive weight caused the 2-ton truck to tilt to the side, nearly rolling over into the ditch on the Ashwood dirt road. The driver's side window was completely covered by the monster's terrifying silhouette. It reared up on 2 legs again, standing absurdly tall beside my car. Its elongated snout pressed against the glass, and its bright yellow eyes stared directly at me through the tinted glass. It opened its mouth, revealing its full predatory set of teeth, and let out a growl so violent it made the window glass vibrate against my face. The creature raised its long, muscular arm, preparing to smash the window and pull me out of the cabin. I shoved the key into the ignition with a desperate movement and turned it. The old pickup truck's engine coughed, sputtered from the 30-degree cold, but wouldn't start. "Don't do this to me now, please, start," I yelled, pounding on the dashboard. Outside, the monster delivered the first blow against the glass. A shrill cracking sound echoed through the cabin. The tempered glass didn't shatter on the first try, but transformed into a spiderweb of thousands of cracked pieces, about to collapse. The dogman pulled back its paw to deliver the second blow, the blow that would surely tear the glass and my neck. I could see the details of its skin through the cracks. Its dark fur was thick, full of old scars from fights with other forest animals, and its claws had traces of dried blood clinging to them. The expression on the monster's face was one of pure fury and sadism. It knew I was trapped, stuck in that metal box. I turned the ignition key again, flooring the accelerator. The engine roared loudly, belching thick smoke from the exhaust, and finally came to life. But before I could engage the gear, the monster's paw pierced the broken window glass, gripping the collar of my heavy coat with tremendous force. The tug was so violent that my back was ripped from the seat and my face slammed against the steering wheel of the pickup truck, instantly breaking my nose. Warm blood began to trickle from my mouth and chin, mingling with tears of terror. The monster was trying to pull me out through the narrow gap of the broken window. The putrid smell emanating from its mouth clung to my skin. I could feel the tips of its claws piercing the fabric of my coat and scratching the flesh of my shoulder, causing me excruciating pain. With my free right hand, I desperately groped across the cab floor until my fingers found a heavy 2-mile-range tactical metal flashlight that I used for nighttime hikes. I gripped the flashlight tightly and delivered a violent blow with all the force panic gave me, directly to the dogman's elongated snout. The impact of the metal against the bone made a dry sound. The monster let out a sharp yelp of pain and surprise, loosening its grip on my coat for a fraction of a second. That was all the time I needed. I pushed his body back with my feet, engaged reverse gear with a sharp movement, and slammed my right foot down on the accelerator. The pickup truck's tires spun on the wet dirt, throwing sparks and gravel everywhere before finding traction. The vehicle lurched violently backward, ripping the monster's arm from the cab. The dogman ran alongside the car for a few feet, trying to grip the metal with its claws. leaving deep grooves of torn metal on the side of my black pickup. I shifted into forward gear and turned the steering wheel sharply, throwing the car toward the Ashwood exit road. In the rearview mirror, illuminated by the red lights of the taillights, I saw the monster stop in the middle of the dirt road. It rose to its full monstrous stature of over 7 feet, raised its head toward the full moon, and let out the most terrifying and deafening howl of the entire night. The sound seemed to chase the car as I sped at over 60 miles per hour down that dark road, dodging the trees of the dense forest that seemed to try to hold me back. I didn't look back even once more. My nose was gushing blood, my shoulder burned from the beast's claws, and my car was completely destroyed, but I was alive. I had survived the most terrifying point of my existence. I drove non-stop for 3 hours straight. The speedometer needle wouldn't drop below 75 miles per hour, even on the tightest curves of those back roads in northern Michigan. The freezing wind rushed in violently through the shattered driver's side window, freezing the dried blood on my face and the collar of my torn coat. My hands felt glued to the steering wheel, locked in place by the shock. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering frantically, and it wasn't because of the 30-degree temperature outside, man. It was the reflection of the absolute terror that had taken over every cell in my body. With every mile I put between me and the ghost town of Ashwood, I obsessively looked in the rearview mirror, hoping to see those 2 bright yellow dots emerge from the back of the pickup truck or scurrying across the dark asphalt right behind me. The howl of that canine beast kept echoing in my head, as if it were etched into my memory. I only started to slow down when the first rays of dawn began to cut across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of grey and pale orange, and the lights of the first gas stations on the main highway appeared. I had escaped death, but I knew that a part of me had remained forever in those cursed ruins. When I finally parked in my garage in a residential neighborhood of Detroit, I couldn't get out of the car immediately. I stood there staring blankly, listening to the crackle of the hot engine cooling down. When I finally mustered the courage to look in the rearview mirror, I barely recognized the man reflected there. My eyes were bloodshot. Deep, dark circles marked my pale face, and my broken nose was swollen and crooked. I got out of the vehicle and walked to the side of the pickup truck. What I saw there made my stomach churn. On the black body of the car, just below where the driver's side window was, were 4 deep, perfectly parallel grooves that cut through the metal to the inner steel sheet. They were claw marks, gigantic claws that proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that I hadn't hallucinated in the middle of the forest. It had happened. The Michigan dogman was terrifyingly palpable. I went inside, took off my torn clothes that smelled of that rotten odor of decaying flesh, and went straight to the shower. I let the hot water fall on my injured shoulder, watching the red water run down the drain while feeling the burning sensation of the 4 deep scratches the beast had left on my skin. Those scars would be my eternal reminder that we are not alone at the top of the food chain. In the days that followed, I tried to find answers. I needed to understand what that monstrous creature was, and if anyone else knew of its existence. I started searching obscure internet forums and old archives of local Michigan newspapers. I discovered dozens of similar accounts, terrifying stories of hikers, hunters, and forest rangers who had disappeared without a trace near Ashwood in recent decades. Many reported encounters with the Dogman, a beast over 7 feet tall with inverted joints that had haunted the region since Native American times. I mustered my courage and went to a local police station to report the attack on my pickup truck, making up a story about a large bear to avoid being committed to a psychiatric hospital. The veteran sheriff who attended me listened to my account in silence. When I showed him photos of the grooves in the truck's metal and the scratches on my shoulder, his expression changed. He didn't make jokes. He simply wrote down the data, sighed deeply, and told me in an extremely low and serious tone, Young man, if I were you, I'd forget Ashwood exists and never set foot near those woods again. There are things in that dark forest that the government prefers to keep quiet to avoid causing general panic. Today marks exactly 1 year since that autumn night that shattered my peace. I never picked up my camera again for urban exploration. I sold all my equipment. My life has become a perpetual state of alert. I changed all the locks on my house to double locks and installed powerful spotlights with motion sensors around the perimeter of my yard. Even so, the night remains my worst torment. Every time the sun sets and the strong wind begins to shake the trees on the street, my heart races. I can't sleep without leaving a light on in the hallway. And worst of all are the nightmares. I wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in cold sweat, swearing I can hear the click of dark claws climbing the stairs of my house, or the sound of an elongated snout sniffing the crack in my bedroom door. Sometimes, when the neighborhood is completely silent, I have the terrible impression of hearing far away that hybrid and sadistic howl echoing in the darkness of the Detroit night. I know he knows who I am. I know he memorized my scent, just as I memorized his. I decided to share this story with you here on the Mr. Nightmare Scares You channel because I couldn't bear to carry this secret alone any longer. I needed this relief, this catharsis, to show that the monsters of urban legends and horror stories are terrifyingly palpable and walk among the shadows of our world. The Dogman is out there, in the dense forests of the United States, waiting for the next careless hiker or curious explorer who decides to cross the borders of his bloody territory. If you're driving down a dark dirt road in northern Michigan and you start to smell a putrid odor of decaying flesh, or if your car radio suddenly starts malfunctioning, don't stop. Don't get out to take pictures. Don't make the same mistake I made. Turn around and run as fast as you can before you see 2 yellow eyes gleaming 7 feet high in the trees. Pay attention to the shadows, look over your shoulder, and remember, the darkness hides secrets your mind isn't prepared to handle. If this true story made your blood run cold and left you staring into the shadows of your room, don't leave without leaving yours. Subscribe to the channel now, Mr. Nightmare Scares You, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any terrifying stories we bring you here. And tell me in the comments below, would you have the courage to spend a night in a ghost town if you knew something was hunting you? Share this video with that friend of yours who loves horror, and until the next nightmare,